Hello, everybody. Welcome to Simania, Salon Readings, a platform that I coordinate as part of the activities organized by the Association of Latin American Jewish Studies, known as LAJSA. My name is Cynthia Gabbay, and I am a researcher and writer. I currently work at Humboldt University in Berlin, and my research is funded by the German Research Foundation. Today, we gather for the presentation of Keren Fraiman and Dean Phillip Bell's new volume, the Routledge Handbook of Judaism in the 21st Century. Simania, which in Hebrew means bookmarker, was conceived to provide a space to discuss books published in the field of Latin American Jewish studies, or which are of interest to our discipline, whether recent or long-standing. Today we have less time than usually, so instead of doing a bigger introduction, I will just present the participants who are the editors of this volume. And I hope we will have some time also for discussion. I just will announce the next meeting that is also scheduled in a special time, because usually we have a meeting every month, but this time we will have one before the holidays. So our next meeting will take place next week on December 20, and we will present the book by Gustavo Guzman, Attitudes of the Chilean Right Towards Jews, from Acceptable Undesirables to Respected Businessmen. So I will introduce first Keren Fraiman. She's Spertus Institute's Dean and Chief Academic Officer. She also holds a faculty appointment as Associate Professor of Israeli Studies. She previously served as Director of Research and Evaluation at the Center for Israel Education, where she continues to serve on the faculty of the iFellows Master's Concentration in Israel Education program. In January 2020, Dr. Fraiman was selected for the prestigious Wexner Field Fellowship presented by the Wexner Foundation in partnership with the Jim Joseph Foundation. She received her PhD in International Relations and Security Studies from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology and her BA in Political Science and Near Eastern Languages and Civilizations from the University of Chicago. Her work has been supported by the U.S. Institute of Peace, the National Consortium for the Study of Terrorism, and the Chicago Project on Security and Terrorism. A former Schusterman Israel scholar, Dr. Fraiman has worked at the Crown Center for Middle East Studies at Brandeis and led trips to Israel as a facilitator both for Encounter and Birthright Israel. Dean Phillip Bell is the ninth president and CEO of Spertus Institute for Jewish Learning and Leadership. In addition, Dr. Bell holds a Spertus Institute faculty appointment as Professor of History. He has served on the faculty at DePaul University, Northwestern University, Hebrew Theological College, University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign, and the University of California, Berkeley. A leading voice for the advancement of Jewish higher education, Dr. Bell has served as President, Vice President, and Secretary-Treasurer of the Midwest Jewish Studies Association, and has been a member of the Board of Directors of the Association for Jewish Studies. He's a widely published author in the areas of medieval and early modern Jewish history. Bell earned a BA in medieval history at the University of Chicago and an MA and PhD in early modern history at the University of California, Berkeley. His current research focuses on early modern cultural responses to natural disaster and severe weather, as well as vulnerability, resilience, and religious leadership. So we are going to present, I will give the word to our editors of the Routledge Handbook of Judaism in the 21st Century, and we will start, please, with Keren Fraiman.
Actually, we'll start with me, but
I'm sorry.
No,
you can start.
We saved the best for last, and so I'll just get us off on a rocky foot, and then Keren can clean it all up. But first, thank you, Cynthia. It was a remarkable invitation to share some thoughts about this volume with distinguished colleagues and to enter into some conversation around it. It's one of those rare opportunities. I know many of us have had the experience that you publish a book and then the 2 or 3 people who have read it, might send you an email at some point, but actually to engage with people who are thinking about similar issues across many different perspectives is really welcome opportunity. So we want to thank you for that. And we had an opportunity to watch some of the videos of some of the other programs, which are really just wonderful. So thank you for all the wonderful work that you do. I wanted to say a bit about the project, and I think Keren and I had sort of set up a goal of maybe providing about a half hour worth of sort of context for the volume and some of the big things we thought about, as well as the process that we went through in organizing it, and as a way maybe to facilitate some conversation around some key themes. Again, since we have a little bit of a limited time frame, we're not going to do all the talking because we'd love to engage in some conversation with you. But we thought we'd start off with a little bit about how the book came to be, because as we've probably all experienced, books never go through a particular linear progression. And oftentimes we enter into conversations with publishers and colleagues about lots of different ideas we have. And by the time we finish them, they don't look at all like what we had originally imagined them to be. And this, I think, was a similar experience. Keren will talk a little bit about the context in which it was created, but I'll say that we'd been approached by Routledge. And Routledge does publish, obviously, a wide range of books on many different subjects. And we've done some work with them before in history. And they had written to us and said, we think there's a need for a comprehensive history of Jewish history, a sort of comprehensive Jewish history. And we said to them, why would you think that? There's lots of books out there that really are really good in field-specific areas, but also really important overviews of Jewish history as well. And as we started having some back and forth with them, we raised some really interesting questions about what do we actually mean by Jewish studies? What do we mean by Judaism? Where are there areas that have received less attention, particularly as we think about looking at broader Jewish studies and global Jewish and Judaism experiences? And we actually proposed something quite different than they might have imagined initially. And they were really open to hearing about it. They, of course, sent it to a bunch of reviewers, as they always do. And I think what people thought was fascinating about the way we were thinking about it was the variety of topics that we were hoping to engage, the diversity of contributors that we were planning to try to solicit for the volume, but also the way that we were organizing it and thinking about how the topics intersected with each other. Because it wasn't really a straight history, and it wasn't really a kind of conceptual overview of Judaism as a religion. And so for us, it became a very different kind of a book, but it was happening against the backdrop of some, let's say, larger societal and community changes, which I'll ask Keren to say a little bit about, because that inflected the way that we thought about the volume, but also how it came to be. We'll talk a little bit about how the volume sort of crystallized what some of the areas of focus were, some of the challenges, and then look at some of the specific issues related to the 3 key sections. And then after that, we'd love to sort of delve into any of the specific issues that might be of interest. So Keren, maybe you could give us a little bit of the color commentary on the sort of context.
Sure. So maybe I'll just start with maybe an obvious question, which has to do with like what brings a medieval historian and a security scholar together for a volume, because it doesn't necessarily seem like an obvious pairing in a certain way. And Dina and I do a lot of work together in running the institution, but really our scholarly work has been quite different. But the truth is, one of the things that really inspired us to think about this volume and to bring it together has to do with the teaching that we do within our programs. And Spertus Institute for Jewish Learning and Leadership is an institution that has both more traditional master's and doctoral programs in Jewish studies, but also a program in Jewish professional studies, which works with the community to train and empower leaders within the Jewish community. And through that work and through our teaching, it raised these questions around like, what are the varied ways in which we think about Judaism in the 21st century? And the truth is, our best teachers were our students, who don't think about Jewish studies in sort of traditional silos, but really think about them in cross-cutting ways that touch across different various disciplines, and it impacts their work in ways that maybe aren't traditionally characterized within academia. And so this volume really gave us a playground in a certain way to think about, what is Judaism in the 21st century? How do we understand it differently than we might traditionally think about it? What are the interesting points of connection that within the silos of academia we might not find? And really think about not only where we are now, because we're just starting the 21st century, so it's funny to think about that, but also what does it mean for the future? Not in a predictive way, not in a way that says this is what the future will hold, but really raising what are the new questions that are already emerging in the first 20 years of this century that may inform the way the next 80 years will look like. And it was a sort of a funny time to put this book together. And I'll share that we had been in touch with the publisher for a long time, and we found ourselves at a local coffee shop, not even a very good coffee shop, to be honest, on a Friday as in March, and you may remember that March of 2020 was, as at least in North America, the world was beginning to shut down. The East Coast had already had spaces that were shutting down, schools that were closing, but Chicago was still sort of not figuring out, like, is this going to come by plane or not? And we sat at a coffee shop and we looked at each other and we said, I think something big is about to happen. Do we hit send on our proposal? Because we didn't know. We had not yet shut down our institution. I will share that we did on Monday. So this is literally on the eve of what becomes 6 months of at-home work. And I think what we realized was it's precisely because something big felt afoot that it was time to really think about what was happening. And perhaps against our better judgment, or maybe our better judgment, I don't know, we hit send on the proposal. And I think what was interesting about pulling together a book during COVID is that it's interesting to think about big questions in times of uncertainty. And I think especially today, as we're thinking about this particular time of uncertainty, especially as it relates to what's happening in Israel and the war between Israel and Hamas, it's interesting to think, like, on the eve of COVID, as COVID was a global pandemic, which meant that it impacted many of our global contributors in ways that were not isolated, for example, to issues that are just in North America. Or this was the moment in which we were asking people to pause and reflect and think about how Judaism would be affected. And in that, I think it led us to ask different kinds of questions, like, what are our global connections? How do we understand things that affect us regionally versus, elements that are far more universal? And how do we understand them? And it's funny to think that a pandemic could give us the space to think about it, but in some way, we were home. We had some time, and many of the scholars that contributed to the volume had time to publish during this time. And we were grateful that actually very, very few backed out of their commitments as we continued. But it was really an important time to say, where are we now, and how do we think these things will impact the future? Dean, I'll pass it to you.
Yeah, no, thank you, Keren. I wanted to pull out a couple of things that she mentioned just to elevate them. One was what made this volume different as we were thinking about it, and it does comprise 3 separate sections with 25 essays by 27 contributors, is that it was intended to be global. And I do think the moment allowed us a question to think about what it meant to be global and what Judaism means in historical context. But it was also that sort of forward-looking idea. Not that we would be predictive necessarily. We weren't imagining what was going to happen in the future, although we did ask the authors to imagine that in 2050, Judaism might look different, and what would that look like in their particular field. But I think those 2 things made the volume different than many volumes that were being considered that were out there already in publication. That is the sort of global nature and the forward-looking part of it. I think the other thing that, we both dabble, as many of you do, I'm sure as well, in grappling with postmodernity and postmodern theories and structural criticism and other issues. And we thought that was a really important conversation, to place those into discussion with some broader, larger themes within Jewish studies and Jewish history, again, with a contemporary and a future-looking focus. And so one of the things that came out, I think, very much, and Keren and I had done a little bit of work of this recently on diversity and peoplehood. And peoplehood has gotten a rather negative rap in many contexts, because what is a peoplehood after all, and who's defining it, to what goals and to what ends? But one of the things that we had thought about is that in the modern world, with the creation of meta-narratives, there is a sense that there is one collective identity. People either belong to it or they don't. And in a postmodern world, and we actually think in a pre-modern world as well, it was a lot more complicated. And identities were more hybrid, and there were more intersections between different ways of thinking and different ways of behaving. And so our sense is that actually creating a meta-narrative around diversity rather than collective identity is a really interesting way of rethinking the notion of peoplehood and connection. So both within that global context, but also with a sort of looking ahead to future generations, we thought it would be really interesting to bring a whole set of different scholars together. Some more established, some a little bit more junior, some working in areas of intellectual and philosophical issues, others in arts and culture, some in sort of traditional institutions, and others testing the boundaries of those in different kinds of ways. So for us, it was a very different kind of a volume, which makes it really hard to bring together diverse voices. I will share one of the things that Keren did that I was really proud of. She does this with our faculty as well, is that we often bring together faculty who teach in related areas so that the curriculum has a more holistic feeling to it. They know what other people are teaching, and they know how the work that they're doing ties into other work. So we divided our book into 6 working groups, and we invited all the contributors to meet to get to know each other. The funny thing was most of them knew each other by name and by publication, but had never met in person. And so Zoom and COVID was a good time to be able to introduce people at a distance. But we had them talk about what are the big ideating things on their plates? What are the issues that they've really concerned with in their scholarship and the things they're seeing in the field, so that we had a sense of how they might fit together, but also to make sure that there wasn't a lot of redundancy and overlap. And there is a little bit in the book, but I would say generally speaking, there's not a lot of that. And I think that was because of the constructive way that we thought about the volume. I'll say one other thing just about the volume, and then I'll turn to a little bit of the challenges that we saw, and I think we'll continue to see. And that is, we decided, it's always the fun part of the book is to write the acknowledgements and to thank people and colleagues and those folks who are working in libraries and archives and other places who were helpful. But the dedication is always an interesting thing, especially with a co-edited volume, because we could have picked, I don't know, 1 or 2 of our family members or somebody at the institution. We ended up dedicating the book to our children. Keren has 3, I have 4. 3 of mine live in Israel. And so we had this interesting opportunity to say, the book really is about them and the future generations. And the way that we're thinking about Judaism, and I'll say a little bit about what we mean by Judaism later, but the notion of Judaism as it moves more staunchly into the 21st century and beyond. So for us, it was a really grounding kind of experience that cemented the relationship we had in the work we were doing. In terms of the challenges, I'll just say a couple things, and then I'll turn it over to Keren, because I think one of the things that we saw was many of the things that we imagined had changed already by the time the book came out, because things have accelerated so quickly within the Jewish world, but far beyond as well. The first question that we grappled with was the question of whether we could be comprehensive or representative. It is impossible to write a Jewish history in a kind of comprehensive way. And so even the notion of who we chose to be contributors and what themes we asked them to address, or what they eventually addressed, because oftentimes contributors address whatever they want to address. They write a title that suggests that they're talking about what you asked them to, but then the body of the text is something completely other. In most cases, actually, they were closely aligned, and I appreciated that. But we had a long discussion about what was comprehensive and what it meant to be comprehensive, especially in a postmodern world where the notion of being comprehensive doesn't make any sense anyway, and what it meant to be representative. And we really wanted to be global. And so in each of the essays, you will see there's a question about Israel, there's issues about Latin America, about Europe, about North America, about other sort of diverse regions where there are Jewish presence. And that was a really strong, motivating conversation piece about how much we wanted to get into detail and how much we were looking at sort of broad representative trends in different kinds of ways. The other thing that I'll say before I turn it to Keren was that we also, while we wanted to be looking forward, we didn't assume that we could be predictive. And as it turns out, we couldn't have been, because many things changed over the course of 3 years, but particularly around Israeli politics and other kinds of things, but broader social conditions as well. And so we were in a strange position in this volume, trying to do something different, I think quite new in some ways, and probably very challenging, and yet a different kind of approach than we've seen in much of the scholarship around broader Jewish history and study of Judaism. Keren, I don't know, you want to say something about the sort of changes that we saw in some of the shifting focus?
Great. And maybe I'll say just one more thing around the challenge of representation. I think one of the things that we wanted the authors to do was to be provocative, but not for the sake of provocation, but really thinking about what are the edges of our understanding and of community and of Judaism that ought to be raised. And I think, you see this particularly, and we can talk about some of the specifics, but around issues of power, which I think is sometimes something that can make us a bit uncomfortable, or thinking about gender or thinking about tradition. We really wanted to put the big questions on the table and not be sort of afraid to skirt around them. And that's as true in the conversations about Israel as it is around gender and orthodoxy and sexuality, and thinking about what is evolving in our tradition and how do we think about even sacred texts in a digital time. And we really wanted to put not only Jewish questions, but societal questions on the table in a Jewish context. And I think that has always been one of the guiding parts of our institution in terms of applied Jewish learning. But it isn't necessarily the case, I guess, that we would put something about the environment, like maybe that's other, but we felt that it was important to think about the environment and the earth in a Jewish context, or thinking about how do we understand even, not only issues of language, but not just Hebrew, right? Like really thinking about global Jewish languages and how that is changing over time. Obviously, we can't imagine what we can't imagine, and I think it's interesting to do this program today. And I think in preparing for this program, Dean and I said, like, what's changed and what's not changed. And as a scholar of Israel and Middle East politics and conflict, I'll say that there is a cyclical nature to conflict and some of the things that we see. And so there's always this question of like, what's new and what's just another cycle of violence. And yet this moment for us, I think, feels very different. I think there is something cataclysmic that happened on October 7th that has changed or has elevated many aspects of the Jewish experience globally, not just in Israel, and will be a marker, I think, historically that we'll look back on as something that's changed. I know in my recent trip to Israel, people said everything's changed. And I don't usually believe that everything has changed, but many things have changed. And I know that it's impacted the way that we think. And in looking back on the volume, you said, like, what couldn't we see? When we began this volume, we had a little bit on anti-Semitism. Today, it feels like we could write so much more, right? And so many things that, particularly the anti-Semitism on the left, which I think is present in this volume, but I think even more thinking about, what are the various expressions of global anti-Semitism and what are some of the things we thought were maybe contained and are not contained, I think would have been one thing that we may have focused more on. Israeli politics are never dull. It's interesting to think that when we commissioned the piece, or when we reached out to scholars, it was before the protests, and then they had to adapt them to the protests. There was even this moment where they had to change who was the prime minister, because that had changed since the beginning and then in the middle. But I think today, thinking about some of the, particularly Udi Aron's article on the threat environment, parts of it are actually still very relevant. And I think that highlights that maybe not everything has changed, but some of these things have been elevated even beyond what we could have, as Dean said, beyond what we could have predicted. And I think that's always the challenge of like, are these just markers in time, right? Like, is there's just a moment when we hit send and and what are the enduring lessons? And I think it's the challenge of a book that does have a forward-looking goal. And yet, when I looked over the essays in preparation, I think some of the big questions that we had raised are even more relevant today. There weren't really new questions that I would have said, oh, this would have been the thing to raise, but maybe discuss differently. And in some certain way, I guess that feels good that we did hit these big questions that continue to endure. I'll pass it to you.
Yeah, I was going to say that the eternal sort of questions, or the larger questions that have existed over longer periods of time in conversation with changing circumstances, is a kind of definition of Judaism and Jewish history, I suppose, in some ways. And so that is captured in the volume and the ebb and flow of it. And while things do go out of date, including like demographic statistics and things like that, it's interesting. Sergio Della Pergola, who I know participates in this group with some regularity, was telling me that, he's predicted demographic shifts out to 2050 and beyond. And how do we think about the implications of those as we move forward in thinking about the Jewish communities writ large? One of the big questions we had was the title itself. And the title says Judaism. And we had a lot of reviewers who questioned whether or not Judaism was the right topic to be addressing. Was it Jewish studies? Was it Jewish history? Was it Jewish culture, Jewish communities? Judaism feels like a religion. And I suppose what we ended up deciding is that we took a kind of Kaplan-esque approach to Jewish civilization, imagining that Judaism incorporated all aspects of the Jewish experience, not simply the religious ones. And there had been some interesting books that have come out more recently, sort of problematizing the notion of what we mean by religion more generally. I think we also sort of took a postmodernist approach and a philosophical approach that Hans-Georg Gadamer would have been happy with, in that we thought about the idea of tradition, right, sort of traditional ways of thinking about religion and sources, but put them into conversation with contemporary issues, the kind of living tradition that Gadamer talks about, where tradition is still a rooting. Text and religious ideas are still core to what we do, but we interrogate them from a contemporary perspective and sometimes change them, sometimes continue with them, but make meaning of them. And much of the volume really felt like it was around those kinds of issues. We'll say just a little bit about the structure of the book, the main sort of arguments and areas of focus, and then we'd love to engage in some conversation. And I know Cynthia's got some reflections as well. So we ended up with 3 sections in this book, and they're not exactly equal in terms of the number of essays in each one, But I think what you find in it is that it's a diversity of scholars and presentations and topics that hold together in some interesting ways. The first range of topics we ended up with, we sort of formed around the concepts of identities and geographies. What's interesting about that is that we don't often take identity and geography to be exactly the same, and I don't think they are in this volume either, but there are interesting intersections. And I think for a group like yours, thinking about Latin American Jewish experiences as well, there are these interesting questions about when geographies and identities intersect and don't, and when they intersect across differences. And we had a number of essays in there that looked at sort of basic demographic kinds of issues, but also questions of identity from a community as well as from a philosophical perspective. And one of the interesting motifs, and this was David Gottlieb's essay, the first one that we began the volume with. David, just for full disclosure, is on faculty here at Spertus also. And it is one of those wonderful things with these volumes is that you get to engage with old friends and colleagues, but you get to meet new people as well. So many of the people in the volume we had never met, but we knew of their work and we engaged with conversations. But David introduced the idea of fractals, the idea that there are these kind of representative structures and patterns that exist at different levels throughout the environment, throughout the world in which we live, and try to identify what are those fractals of Jewish identity, and how do we see them being played out in different kinds of ways. We engage with the question of peoplehood that I mentioned before, because while peoplehood seemed to emerge in the 20s and 30s as a kind of coalescing concept, and certainly had a connection with Zionism, it's gone through a lot of ups and downs over the last 100 years. Many people have rejected it. We actually included an essay by Noam Pianko, who's written a small volume on peoplehood, and where he's sort of critical of the notion of peoplehood, and yet comes around to suggest that there is some benefit in thinking about peoplehood and collective identity and memory. In this section, we also thought about issues related to ethnicity and language, because those are identity markers, and they're interesting ways of thinking about how we create identities or actually separate out identities in our day-to-day existence, whether it's related to religious expression or more sort of general everyday kinds of interactions. So the first part was around identities and geographies, and I think has a postmodern ring to it. I know there's a lot of critique of what we even mean by identity today. And so we purposely tried to make it both plural and expansive and look at a variety of different examples, even if it wasn't completely comprehensive. The second area I think Keren's going to talk a little bit about related to structures and powers was an interesting amalgam of essays as well.
Sure. And so I think similar to identities and geography, structures and powers felt like a moment in where both structures and power was shifting. And I think part of what we had hoped to elevate here were the areas that and sort of problematizing notions of both structures and powers. I know in North America, though I think this is a global phenomenon as well, for example, Jewish institutions are becoming far more decentralized. And so what does that mean? And I think in this moment where these institutions that for the 20th century felt so central to the Jewish experience are now losing their impact and their influence. And so what does that mean for community? What does it mean for power? How do we think about that? Similarly, I think questions of race have been very interesting in that I think they have challenged both how Jews understand themselves in racial terms or whiteness, and this is both questions of power and privilege and access, but also what does it mean to be a minority in some cases a targeted minority, as we've seen through the rise of anti-Semitism, and also deal with these broader notions of privilege and power that are afforded by being often perceived as white. I think the one that I think when the global questions of power, I think, are ones that we often deal with, and I think Israel and the role of Israeli power and how we think about it in an internal, regional, and an international perspective. And I will say that Udier Ran's article really packs a punch in this regard, because we said you have a very short space and talk about everything, and he somehow managed to do it. But I think in part he was able to do it because he problematized notions of power that sometimes, how do we think about the balance of power in each of these settings and where are biggest issues of threat? And interestingly, I think his essay continues to elevate the big questions that Israel has faced in the 21st century and will continue to face and is currently facing. But I think the ones that were most interesting to me were about sort of new spaces of power and structure. And I think both questions of family, intermarriage, and sexuality were sort of new spaces of thinking about how have these boundaries been re-understood, and maybe even in spaces where we view them as more static. And so I think oftentimes there was a sense, for example, that in intermarriage, it's the woman who has a role. And so we wanted to look at, well, what is the role of men? And I think Keren McGinnity's article highlighted that we should really focus on what it means to have continuity, as particularly as it relates to gender. And Simcha Feuerman, who was one of our students, one of our doctoral students, really challenges these notions of how do we think, for example, what are the impact of different sexual modesty codes, and how do they, and in general, his work more broadly is around sort of the challenges and opportunities of understanding sexuality, even in a very traditional Orthodox framework. And I think here too, it's sort of challenging the boundaries of these traditional institutions and power that have come to define that. And I think when we started to look at all of these shifts that were sort of happening underneath, all of the authors in a certain way pause for this moment and not only share like what are the big changes that they've seen, but what are their likely impacts going into the future. And here, like even thinking about it, here's one where I would say, like, how do we understand the Holocaust today, especially since the Holocaust and the memory of the Holocaust has been invoked so often in the last couple of months. But I think these questions and the distance from the Holocaust was, for example, an interesting thing, which, for example, for me was a very grounding thing. I know that that for my generation, the Holocaust felt very present, but that's also very different. And the distance from that is something that I think we will need to grapple with. And even as we start to think about other events that are happening in our history, what is their role in memory? I'll just share anecdotally that one of the many individuals that I met in Israel on a recent trip a few weeks ago was someone who was one of the survivors from Kibbutz Be'eri. And one of the interesting things that he was talking about is like, how do we memorialize this moment? And one of his ideas, which connects to our one of the articles on digitization, was creating a WhatsApp museum, right? Of thinking about how do you preserve memory through the use of WhatsApp and text messages, which is a very different kind of way to think about memory and memorialization than perhaps the way we've thought about Holocaust and other elements in history. And so thinking about and broadening our ideas, and really this is where I see some of these connections, even across sections, really sharpened, I think, some of the edges and the big changes that we felt underfoot. Dean, do you want to talk about the last one?
Yeah, the last section was two topics as well, and we saw them as being connected again in a kind of post-structuralist way between knowledge and performance. And it's sometimes funny, as I read some of the post-structuralism and the criticism of it, we often raise the question of what is essential, and if there's no essentialisms, can we speak of Judaism at all? And part of what we tried to do in the section is have the authors think about more traditional notions of text and ritual and life, but then problematize them in a way that has them speak to sort of contemporary issues. And so we had chapters in there that dealt with the Bible and the Talmud, but how they're being utilized and engaged in a 21st century setting. There was some stuff in there about how we think about rituals and text and other kinds of things in new ways based on new technologies, but new ways of framing and thinking and understanding. And I will say that we've heard from a number of outside folks that those chapters really resonated with them, because it brought these traditional topics into a contemporary discussion. And the idea of knowledge as being something that is connected to power, although we actually separated it out from the section on power. I think maybe it's a kind of latent criticism of Foucault, where he finds power at play in everything. We do think power is a kind of underlying issue, but not necessarily connected with knowledge or performance in the way that we're thinking about it in this volume. And so we also included a variety of different approaches to the arts. And again, we had to be representative, not comprehensive. So we had things in there related to music and to visual arts and to literature. The literature one actually does raise some interesting questions around Latin American identities. But in some ways, the communal institutions and other things do as well. I'll share that Keren and I were in Santiago, I think pre-COVID at this point, and had lots of conversations about community organization that is shifting dramatically given the changes in demographics. We were in Uruguay also, where the community went from 40,000 to about 10,000. But the communal structures are still in place. And how do you think about community merging across different kinds of institutions, or thinking about institutions in completely new ways? So a lot of that got played out in the structures, but I think also in some ways in the way that we think about knowledge and arts and culture. What was really fun too was to see in a certain sense that some of our scholars were not experts in the particular area that they were addressing, but they brought new lenses to the topic. So my favorite in some ways was Larry Silver, I was a retired faculty member at Penn who really works on Renaissance art. And I remember we were talking to Larry at some point, and I said, we're doing this volume on contemporary Jewish stuff. He says, oh, I've been thinking about that for many years. I'd love to write an article about that. And he ended up doing this article that's sort of on the cusp of modern and contemporary, but bringing his sort of traditional Renaissance painting eye into the discussion of contemporary Jewish expression in the arts. So it becomes a very different kind of an article that he would have ever done, or that I think we would have had we simply found somebody who does contemporary Jewish art. So many of the articles end up having these kind of cross-pollination opportunities, given the backgrounds of the authors and the work that we do. And so knowledge and power, I think, was a sort of knowledge and performance was an interesting one in there. And we paired those in some ways because the performance of knowledge through ritual, through textual analysis, through engagement with artifacts from the past, shapes the way that we think about the knowledge and also changes it fundamentally. The article that Keren mentioned by Joe Skloot, I think, does that really well. He takes an early modern example. He's an early modernist who looks at the impact of printing on codification of Jewish law, Jewish customs, and the like, and compares it and contrasts it with the sort of digitization of texts in the 21st century in a way that asks about the acceleration of the modern moment that's very different from the acceleration of the technology in the 16th century, and yet raises some similar kinds of questions about how that destabilizes the way that we think, the way that we understand the text, the way that we transmit ideas, and the like. So many of these sort of things come together in this section, but overall, and we gave a little bit of thought to sort of broader themes related to Latin American Jewish experiences. I think they resonate in terms of thinking about shifting demographies, different notions of institutions, fluidity of language and religious identities that are clearly true in many different areas, but also thinking about the broader relationship between Jews and non-Jews in regions and Jews across different global contexts, which are really important, both in terms of anti-Semitism, but also in terms of memory and collective identities. That's the volume. It's in a nutshell, it covers a lot of ground, and we didn't want to go into any one specific essay because you could spend many hours on each one of them. But I want to give you a sort of sense of how the book came to be, the sort of conceptual underpinning of it, and how it sort of fits together. Keren, any final things that you want to add? But then we'd love to turn it over to all of you and hear any questions or comments or reflections. And then if there's time, Cynthia, if you could share some of your thoughts as well.
No, I think we covered it.
Thank you very much. This is really very rich. Yes, I have a few questions, but I will give the opportunity to the public in case there are questions. You can write it down or just open your micro and ask.
One thing I'll say, one question I sometimes get is, would you do another edited volume? And I would say only if it's with Keren, because it is like shepherding all sorts of sheep that are running off in many different directions. But part of the fun part of it is engaging in these bigger conversation pieces. So some of you, I'm sure, have edited volumes as well. And I don't know if they're harder or easier. Sometimes they feel harder than writing your own book. And they can sometimes be rewarding. I think this one was, but that's a question that sometimes people ask us.
I agree that co-editing and co-writing is much more fun than doing it alone. So I will go with the first question. First of all, I want to say that I want to tell you two thanks, because I thought the introduction was really interesting, and many times introductions to edited volumes are not really presenting new questions. They're just like a summary of the book. And here it really helped me to get into all the ideas and all the words that were going to be exposed in the book. And I mean, there was a lot of philosophical questions that it took me a long time to start the volume, because I really wanted to stay there and think about them. So, for example, I would like to ask you, of course, from a Jewish perspective, how would you, and of course, relying on all this data that you brought, how would you make the difference between modernity and post-modernity? You talk a little bit about it in the introduction, and I think it's interesting because I feel we are also in some sense going through something that is changing a lot of things, and as Keren said, and maybe this question could be interesting from a historical point of view.
Yeah, I mean, I'm happy to take a first stab at it because I tend to think, and I suggested this earlier, I don't know if anybody would ever agree with me, but I feel like modernity is its own strange 200-year detour in human history. And the early modern and the postmodern have a lot more in common in terms of questions of diversity, hybridity, lack of certainty, multi-narratives, and the like. My sense of modernity, and maybe Keren, you have a different sense of this from an Israel perspective, is that modernity sort of ushers in a sensibility of a meta-narrative and an ideal that one can achieve truth and there's a progression into a particular direction. On the other hand, I also sort of feel like postmodernity shakes that up a bit and says, well, truth is rather subjective. And even in the hard sciences, right? In Germany, we talk about the Wissenschaft des Judentums. Well, there is no science because science itself is interpretive. Moshe Rossman makes this great point that, you know, he's being a bit cheeky because he's criticizing the postmodernists, but he says for them, there's no difference between fact and interpretation. What I think postmodern does is raises the question of what facts are and what truth might look like. And that's different than the kind of modern notion of truth and science and moving forward. But I think this, and I signaled it a bit when I talked about the diversity in peoplehood, is that we often think about modernity and modern Jewish historical experiences as though they're still diverse and there's hybrid identities for sure, yet there is a kind of coalescing meta-narrative that we try to use to hold people and things and ideas together. Postmodernity questions that again. And it doesn't mean that people in the postmodern sort of mindset reject religion. Like I have really interesting conversation with our students about what do we do with the nuns, the people who say that they have no religion, but are going to synagogue every month, at least once a month, right? They don't see themselves as being participatory in a Judaism that looks modern, and yet there is something that connects them. I think there's some really interesting ways in which the postmodern continues many of the modern motifs and themes, but does feel like a break or a rupture. It's a little bit like Yerushalmi's notion of the rupture of modernity. He likes to talk about history becoming the faith of fallen Jews, that because Jews are no longer connected to the memory of the past in an organic way, we superimpose history as a way of connecting them. I think postmodernity sort of re-asks those questions in a different framework. And so part of what we tried to do was problematize that connection. I really appreciate what you said about the questions too, because I remember very clearly Keren and I having a lot of back and forth about the introduction, which started off very much as you talk about, a summary of different chapters and how they fit together. And then we stepped back and said, but what are the underlying questions we're trying to get at? And that actually helped us think about how we put the different essays into conversation with each other, what sections they went to, and how we framed the individual sections as well. And so we stepped back with our sort of teaching lenses on and the experience we had from our students who I think raise these kinds of questions in a way that they grapple with on a day-to-day basis. And from my standpoint, they really represent a kind of postmodern Judaism and postmodern identity. So in some ways, they helped us to shape the way that we framed the volume and then reshaped it after the essays came in. I don't know if you would add something different, maybe.
Sure. I mean, I think yes, and I think for me as a political scientist, I often think of modernity as the age of nationalism, and I think that's where a lot of these meta narratives and these sort of identifications seem very rigid and have very clear boundaries. I think one of the things in thinking about the postmodern period is the dissolution of some of these very clear boundaries and at least the problematization of what it means to belong. And I think that's part of what we saw, especially in the essays, is how do we question the boundaries of belonging? How do we think about hybridity and identities that no longer fit into clear boxes? We often teach from the Pew Research Survey on the Jewish experience here for our students, and it's interesting to think about, what are the elements, for example, that bind Jews together in a peoplehood notion. And I think over time they've become far more diverse and in some ways far more interesting and in many ways contradictory. I think one of the things, for example, that has been playing out quite a lot on college campuses, but I think in the Jewish experience more broadly today, is actually the clash of these identities that we thought we could dance at all these weddings. And I think this is very postmodern in a certain sense that you could be in all of these different spaces even when they're contradictory. And it's led to a particular loneliness right now for many particularly liberal Jews who felt that they could dance at many different weddings and are now finding themselves isolated from spaces that they thought they could sort of move between. And I think these are some of the questions that we felt defined post-modernity in a way that felt differently siloed in what I would call the period of the era of nationalism or the height of these sort of very clear, or at least in theory, right? Like these meta narratives of clear belonging. The other thing I'll just say about questions, because it's one of my favorite topics. In fact, I sometimes teach about asking questions, is that I think one of the things that I think that there was an element of raising those questions for us that came from an understanding that in 20 years, when this volume might still be read, we know that some of the essays will feel dated, but I think our hope was that the questions would not. And I think that one could imagine revisiting these questions in a decade and thinking about, what are the different answers or what are the new essays that ought to be written to address them? Because our hope was that they were more timeless, or maybe of the moment, but really were really of the 21st century and of this postmodern period in a way that's different than any of the essays that really did address them in this particular moment. And so I think I appreciate you noting it, because for us, actually, it was the book began with questions. It was not, it was in part because we weren't going to traditionally organize it. It forced us to ask, what are the big things that we want to tackle? And these essays are one answer or part answers. And there are other essays that could have also been included that would have taken on things that, as Dean said, this isn't comprehensive in a certain way, that could have actually answered them. But our hope is that it framed a bigger conversation about the Jewish experience today.
Thank you very much. That were really interesting answers. So if there are no other questions, I have at least two more. So trying to like take a global look on your volume, and this is a big question, so you don't have to give me an answer, just trying to to, if you want to essay on the data you got here, which is really impressive. If you try to think of this data in a transversal way, would you say, for example, just as an example, that there is a relation between Jewish demography outside of Israel and religious practices and cultural production? Like, can you think of a transversal questions that go through all these different examples and try to think what kind of different perspective it could bring?
I'm happy to. Actually, your question for me gets at an issue that is also postmodern in a certain way, maybe connects to the other question, which is around causality. And I do think oftentimes we traditionally have, in Jewish history, have looked at questions of demographics as an example and thought about what the impact might be on community institutions, community identities, community stability relations with the broader world and the like. And I think there's still some truth to that, but I actually think one of the things that came through, and I'm glad you gave the example in Israel, is that on the one hand, what Sergio does and what I think Sami Smuha and others pointed out in some of their essays was there is a demographic shift that's going to have major implications for the state of Israel as a nation state, but also for its sort of religious identities. And we can see some of those trends. And yet all it takes is a major intervening event like an October 7th or something else that could flip those in a different direction, and they could have a completely different implication. The other thing that I'll say is that in the diasporic sort of sense, I'm not sure that the correlation between, say, demographic trends and certain kinds of cultural and religious changes is necessarily always what we had assumed it to be. I think Keren's notion of the intermarriage question becomes a really interesting one. Over the last decade, we've changed that whole conversation where intermarriage was really a challenge because it somehow affected notions of Jewish continuity. And the newest discussions are, well, that's an opportunity to grow the Jewish footprint and the Jewish communal sort of size by engaging those people in a different kind of a way. So I think the demographics, and again, it's causality in some ways, but I think challenging the causality is also a kind of predictive postmodern approach as well. So some of it still holds true. I think some of those are really sort of very traditional approaches, and they resonate with the way we think about Jewish historical development, and others are really hard to predict. And I'm not sure that there's a direct link between the sort of sense of causation and effect. And even if there is, in certain cases, there's multiple levels of causality, in the same way that there's multiple sort of hybrid levels of identity. And we need to sort of understand all of those and how they may play out in different kinds of ways. So yeah, it's a provocative question. And I think what it proves is that some things have changed and some things have not. and that as we look ahead and we try to be global and forward-looking, the task is really much greater. And that's why, at the end of the day, the essays themselves will become dated at some point. But I think, as Keren suggested, the ways of framing the questions or asking what's underneath those developments might be more productive as we think ahead. Keren, I don't know if you wanted to add anything to that.
I wanted maybe to focus a little bit on the Israel essays in relation to this question, because I think particularly Sami Smuha's essay, but also Udi Ron's essay on this, elevated certain assumptions or realities that they each saw that have changed the bigger political questions that are coming up, even notions of democracy. And again, like we sort of take a time capsule of when this was written, it was written before, or as the protest movement was emerging, and certainly long before we could have imagined October 7th. But in rereading these essays, questions of how, for example, religious identity intersect with politics in Israel is at the heart of a lot of conversations that are happening today. And I think some of these assumptions around the relationship of, for example, the Orthodox to the state are exactly at the heart of a lot of the efforts that we're seeing now in terms of the debates and discussions, and even some important shifts that are happening. But underneath it, I think, as I think about, for example, the question of, what is the relationship of the Israeli Palestinian population to the state, I think I'm watching through the lens that Sami Smuha has helped me understand, right? And I think that in thinking about what does it mean to live in a diverse Israeli society, and what are the implications and the different notions of statehood, of democracy, of religion and state, of even intergroup relations in Israel, this is playing out even after October 7th, right? And maybe in ways that are slightly different than what he could have imagined, right? But I think underneath these same issues will come back, and we're already seeing them coming back. And so in that regard, like, it's interesting to think, like, how do these frames of analysis help us to process even moments of crisis? And in that way, I think they are enduring past the moment in which they were written.
Thank you. So just to close, but thinking really, do you think, looking back and I understand that these chapters or articles were written more or less between the 2020, 2021, and when I saw Sergio de la Pérgola's article, which I'm really fan of his way of writing and opening his question on prediction, how difficult it is to predict something. Do you when you reread this text now, do you think there are some data there that absolutely changed or became wrong after the October 7th? Something that should be rewritten?
I think that I'll jump in on a few things. Is that okay, dude? I'll take it first. I think that there are some things about Israel that could be rewritten as a starting point. I think one of the things that has changed since October 7th, and I think we're still in the crisis, and so it will take a little bit of time to sort it out. But I think there were big assumptions about where threat comes from, that I think there was a bigger emphasis on international threat and even regional threat, and not on the local threat. And in a certain way, there was a sense that the Israeli-Palestinian conflict was in a status quo that was painful, but was immovable and was sort of contained. I think these notions of containment were shattered on October 7th. And I think that changed the regional, both the notions of threat in terms of like local to regional to international. At the same time, I think there are parts of the regional story that haven't changed, right? I think it's really interesting, for example, to note that when the Saudis gathered the Arab states, they did not have a Khartoum conference where they said 3 no's, right? They didn't come out of that conference on one side. In fact, they came out with a sort of open stance, and there's still open channels of communications even around Saudi relations. And I think that highlights a change that Udi Ron, for example, highlighted in terms of Israel's changing space in the Middle East, that I think has withstood its place despite what happened on October 7th. And one could have imagined, for example, a very different counterfactual of saying it would have again split up the region as we imagined in the 20th century. And I think, at least right now, and like every time I say something about right now, I feel like I could be wrong in about a week and a half. But right now, it does feel like it's more nuanced, it's more layered, it's more complicated. The relationship between the Arab states and the Palestinians is complicated. It's not one-dimensional as we might have imagined it in the past, though it never was that way. And I think so. I think those are things that have that. But there are these kind of big assumptions in the Israel story that need to be challenged. I think notions of democracy, which I think Sami Smuha's essay certainly problematized, were even further elevated, and those would need further refinement. And again, I think we'll have to wait to see how it all shakes out. But I think these will come back, right? I think the questions of civil society and other kinds of expressions of dissatisfaction or a rupture between the citizen and the state, which occurred already before October 7th, but which were magnified, I think, after October 7th, are things that will need to be sorted out and require an academic treatment, I think, to better sort through. I think the other thing I would say is around anti-Semitism. I think that not only the spike in anti-Semitism, I think there's always been a connection between things that happen in Israel and anti-Semitism globally, but I think these connections, particularly as they relate to North America, have been challenged even further. But I think, and we just completed a leadership certificate in combating anti-Semitism where we problematized some of these questions, but I think not only how normalized sentiments of anti-Semitism have been in the public sphere, but also their prevalence on the left and on the right, which we always knew, and I think are present in some of the discussions, but the way in which it's become violent, I think, has been different. And so I think what we now sometimes, I think, crisis, and this I learned from Dean, crisis is a decision point in Greek, and I think in a certain way, October 7th is a crisis that has revealed things, and I often say that we can't unsee them, right? I think in the United States, in the race question, the murder of George Floyd represented that moment where we could no longer not see systemic racism. It was always there, but it was now clear. And I think October 7th has clarified things in Israel and globally for Jews that can no longer be unseen. And I think some of these things were not addressed as sharply as they could have, because I'm not sure we realized in 2020 or 2021 that we were at a decision point, or that there may have been decision points. I mean, I think for example, the congressional hearings on anti-Semitism highlighted some of those tensions and decision points that are facing the Jewish community in really sharp ways that I think not every essay addresses. Tina, you probably have more to add, so I'll pass it.
No, actually, those are the three areas I think I would have mentioned, and around race, anti-Semitism, and Israel in particular. I'm sure there are others, but those came immediately to mind. For me, though, Cynthia, the way you phrased the question was also interesting, because with my postmodern hat on, I would say there are not wrong essays, and they don't need to be rewritten. What we need to understand is that they are reflecting a moment in time and a particular perspective. And that's a really interesting insight, because those will continue to shift as things unfold as we move into the future. So and in some ways it's interesting too, the sort of liberalism, which we had some sort of sensibilities around in the academic area, seems to be at odds with a wokeism that's a little bit different than that. And I sometimes think about the liberal as being a sort of reflective of a Enlightenment modernism mentality, and wokeism as a sort of postmodern political extension of that in some ways. And so those come to an interesting head related to your previous question. But I think, that in fact, what the volume demonstrates by the fact that it itself is fluid and changeable and not definitive is the future of Judaism and broader society. And so it reflects that kind of moment in timeness, and this notion that there are always going to be different perspectives, and things will change as a result of new conditions or new perspectives that we might have. So in a certain way, it's also the perfect way to end the conversation, because I think it gives you a sense of what the book is and isn't, as it reflects what is and isn't true about Judaism in the 21st century.
Right. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
If we don't have another question, so I will close here, and thank you. It was enriching. It was really clarifying. I wish you a nice next meeting you have, and see you Simania Public next week.
All right. Chag Sameach. Thank you.
Chag Sameach.